Welcome to this mini primer on Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. My name is Craig Forces. Section 7 reads, "Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice." In practice, this section should be subdivided into two components, trigger and content. In terms of trigger, Section 7 applies where there is a prospect of deprivation of life, liberty, or security of the person. The conjunctive "and" in Section 7 should be read as an "or" in practice. Because the Charter applies to the conduct of Canadian governments in both the legislative and executive branches of the state at federal and provincial levels, the deprivation in question must be the product of Canadian state action. But there is an important caveat. The Canadian state actor need not be the entity that inflicts the deprivation. Section 7 will be triggered so long as the Canadian state actor is causally linked to the deprivation. For example, deprivation that's conducted by a foreign state after some intervention by the Canadian state actor. If Canada deports someone to torture, for example, the Canadian government is not doing the torturing, but its actions set in motion the events leading to that torture. Whether the Charter applies to purely extraterritorial conduct by the Canadian state actor, that is, conduct outside of Canada, is a fraught legal issue. But based on the Supreme Court's reasoning in Hape, as modified in Khadr, the Charter appears to apply where Canadian officials engage in conduct in other states that violates Canada's international human rights obligations. The federal courts have suggested that the victim of this violation must also be a Canadian, but this is not a necessary conclusion from the Supreme Court's reasoning. The Charter does not define life, liberty, and security of the person, but court case law fleshes out these concepts. The right to life arises where the state conduct increases the risk of death, either directly or indirectly. The right to liberty includes freedom from physical constraint, but also from state compulsion or prohibitions affecting important and fundamental life choices. It also likely reaches the liberty to move about. Security of the person includes both the right to bodily integrity and also to psychological integrity. For example, security of the person arises where the state imposes non-consensual force to a person's body. Likewise, it arises where the state conduct amounts to a serious psychological incursion with an individual interest of fundamental importance. For example, removing an individual's children from their care and custody, or delays in obtaining necessary medical treatment, can both amount to security of the person infringements. Under Section 7, individuals do not have an absolute right to life, liberty, and security of the person. Rather, they have the right not to be deprived of these without fundamental justice. The principles of fundamental justice constitute, therefore, the content associated with Section 7, once Section 7 is triggered by some state conduct that jeopardizes life, liberty, or security of the person. While the text of Section 7 does not so provide, in practice, the principles of fundamental justice are divided into two broad categories: procedural guarantees and substantive guarantees. Procedural guarantees are sometimes called due process in the American tradition. In Canada, they were better known as natural justice and now as procedural fairness. The substantive guarantees are murkier. Generally, it is useful to divide these substantive guarantees into relatively precise guarantees, usually associated with the criminal justice system, and then broader requirements tied to the rationality of legislation. The precise guarantees include such things as the requirement that certain crimes require a certain minimal level of mental intent or fault before they can be prosecutable in Canadian law, or that a person in detention has a right to silence. The rationality-based requirements generally require that laws not be arbitrary overbroad, or grossly disproportionate. Somewhat related, laws must also not be excessively vague. Vagueness arises when the law is so imprecise it does not give guidance for legal debate. Basically, the law must be precise enough that people understand the obligations that the law imposes with a reasonable degree of certainty. Arbitrariness is when the law's deprivation of life, liberty, or security of the person cannot be connected to the purpose of the law. Overbreadth is when that deprivation goes too far and interferes with some conduct bearing no connection to the law's objective. Gross disproportionality is when the law's impact on the right is grossly disproportionate to its beneficial effect. That is, when the law's impact is totally out of sync with the objective of that law. Now, these considerations overlap to some degree with the provision of the Charter that allows the state to limit charter rights, known as Section 1. However, there are some important differences in the tests applied under these rationality-based critiques in Section 7 versus the justification regime available under Section 1. That is a matter for another primer. More importantly and concretely, there is no instance so far where a majority of the Supreme Court has found a Section 7 infringement justified under Section 1. This is true also for the procedural fairness aspects of the principles of fundamental justice. Here we are speaking about the procedure employed by the executive branch of the state in exercising powers that potentially affect life, liberty, or security of the person. The decision to extradite, for example, or the decision to remove someone under immigration law where they might be tortured upon their return, or a decision to detain someone. Now, there is no fixed menu of procedural guarantees guarded by fundamental justice when these sorts of interests are affected. The procedure is contingent on the circumstances, according to a test articulated by the Supreme Court originally in a case called Baker for common law sources of procedural fairness and then extended to Section 7 fundamental justice in Suresh. Among the most important of these contingent considerations is the impact of the government's conduct on the individual. Basically, the graver the consequences, the more procedural fairness that is required. The precise procedures at issue vary, but include such things as a right to be heard, including a hearing, possibly even an oral hearing, and adequate disclosure, and also a right to an unbiased decision maker. In the criminal context, there are a number of specific procedural standards guarded by fundamental justice. For instance, the right to make full answer and defense in a criminal proceeding. One important aspect of this right to make full answer and defense is adequate disclosure. In the famous Stinchcombe case, the Supreme Court held that the Crown, in practice the police and prosecutors, have an obligation to disclose all material in its possession relating to the criminal investigation, unless the material is clearly irrelevant or privileged, either by common law privileges in the law of evidence, like informer privilege or solicitor-client privilege, or statutory privileges, like the National Security Non-Disclosure Rules in Section 38 of the Canada Evidence Act. Relevance under Stinchcombe means the reasonable possibility that the material might be used by the accused in exercising their right to full answer and defense, or in making decisions about how to conduct that defense. Relevance does not depend on the information being inculpatory or exculpatory. It is broader than that. The workings of Stinchcombe and related disclosure cases is complex and not something that can be treated in full in this mini primer. Finally, an abusive process in an adjudicative setting that triggers Section 7 rights, and especially a criminal trial, violates fundamental justice. Abusive process means an adjudicative process that somehow offends the community's sense of fair play and decency, or which is oppressive or vexatious. Abusive process includes prosecutorial conduct affecting the fairness of the trial, or such conduct that undermines the integrity of the judicial process. State entrapment leading to criminal charges and a trial is also considered an abusive process. This ends this mini primer on Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.